All right, good morning, everyone. It is good to see some familiar faces. So today we are here with our final workshop in this series. And today we're going to be talking about some skills for how we can support faculty through the tenure process. If you are new to our audience, my name is Megan Pollock. I am based out of Dallas, Texas. The name of my company is Engineer Inclusion, and we help people intentionally and systematically engineer equity and inclusion into their organizations. And it really is about how do we all intentionally engineer inclusion and the environments around us. I want to also introduce you to my colleague, Dr. Pamela Lejet Robinson. She is based in Georgia, and she and I have been working together for quite a while now, and she's been with us as well. And so, Pamela, do you want to introduce yourself and say hi?
Sure. So as she said, I'm Pamela, and I am the CEO and founder of PLR Consulting, which is a niche consulting firm that helps organizations and institutions develop and evaluate multifaceted STEM programs to ensure broadening participation for all. So thank you, and I'm excited to start today. And I have a lovely book on P&T. So I was in higher education before darting out the door for about 17 plus years. So I went up the ranks and all that good stuff. So I know quite a bit about P&T and the hurdles. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks. All right, so we're going to move forward, and I'm going to do a quick recap of where we've come from and where we're going. So when we met on February 4th, we talked about practices for reducing the influence of bias on the tenure review process. And I sort of left you with this prompt of like, are you nudgeable? If you recall, we talked about the book Nudge from Thaler and Sunstein. And so that I love that term because thinking about nudging, it's the process of how do we influence our behavior through small changes in information or adaptations in our environment. And that's really what we want to do, because our brains, the way they work, if we want to change the way we operate, we have to give ourselves cues. And so we provided you some tools throughout this series, and we want you to use those tools to change the way that you function in these environments. So there's a couple of links there in the chat around those two books. And then I have shared all of the resources from the 2-4 and the 311 events on my learning management system, and then Tyler has put them on y'all's learning management system. So you have access to all of this. The last time on March 11th, we talked about guidelines for shifting from gatekeeping to stewardship. And so I sent you all an email, I think last week, and I do apologize for it taking me so long to get back to you. Right after our session, my grandma passed away, and I just kind of went under a rock for a little bit. But I got that queued up, and I wrote a blog post on stewarding. And so, and then you can access this handout there, or just if you were at the last session, check your email, and then you'll be able to find this. And so again, we're trying to give you tools that help you change your environment. And we talked about how gatekeeping creates this hostile and exclusive environment, whereas stewardship creates this enriching and inclusive environment. And these are some prompts to help you begin to integrate that. So my next prompt for you is still on the Slido poll is I want to hear what's something that you learned on 2-4 or 311 that you put into practice. What's something that you've learned that you put into practice? How is it going? The nudging concept. The horns and halos, yeah. Reflective questions when formulating feedback, good. What else? Intentionally setting up ground rules and guidelines for how we operate, excellent. Somebody have a specific example that you want to share with the group of something that a practice that you've employed from what we've learned together that was a good experience for you? Feel free to unmute and tell us your story. All right. Looks like setting ground rules is the theme here. Being more explicit and setting expectations. Great. Excellent. All right. I'm going to go ahead and move on. I can encourage you to continue to reflect on what you've learned, and that'll be part of our final exercise today as well. So what we're really talking about today, so if I were to sort of sum it up in an are you question, it's are you listening? And your key takeaway for today is the handout that I put in the chat, and it's a tool for planning your feedback. And so while we're not going to go deep into all of the specific components, this is really an actionable tool for you to use and how you begin to work with anyone, whether it's someone on a tenure committee, whether it's someone on your team, or whether it's your kid. It doesn't matter. These are really good practices for giving effective feedback. But what we're really going to focus our attention on today is how we listen. We're going to talk about asset mindset, and we're going to talk about feedback, and we're going to talk a little bit about the components of listening. And how we're going to get you to practice this is we have some scenarios that highlight some opportunities for you to think about each of these three things and how they play out. And then for those of you who are so inclined, an opportunity to do a little bit of role play in your groups. I know some of you are like, role play, I'm leaving. Don't leave. Like nobody's forcing you to do role play, but you can if you want. So our agenda today, we've got 90 minutes together. We're going to go over the key concepts and have some discussion as a part of that. And then we'll try to take about a 5-minute break at the hour, and then make sure that we're leaving with time to apply the things that we've learned. You know, as I've said in all of our sessions, it's so important when we approach our work around equity to remember that the people aren't broken, and we're not here to fix them. We're not here to fix you. It's so important that we really focus on changing systems and not people, right? We want to change instead of trying to change the way that people think, we aim to change the environment in which people make decisions. I truly believe that every educator I've met has the best intentions of serving the students and serving the people that we work with. And so what we want to do is be very proactive in the ways in which we recognize and remove the barriers that people are facing, and then intentionally add those supports that are going to help them. And so again, keep this in mind as we're moving through this conversation, is that how do we change the way in which we operate? Because if we all leave with oh yeah, that sounds good, nothing's going to change. How do we change the way in which we make decisions, the way in which we frame those guidelines, those expectations, so that we can shift the behaviors long-term moving forward? Setting some sort of ground rules for us. This is the same session pledge that we've used throughout. This is a good equity practice, and it's something I encourage you to use on all of your team meetings, tenure committee review meetings, any kind of meeting. Just a reminder that, we want to stay engaged, and it's not just stay engaged, meaning hey, turn off all of the alerts. That's also important, but we stay engaged for the benefit of ourselves and others. We want to be present and involved. And this is particularly useful when we go into the breakout rooms, stay engaged as much as you can. I fully understand that these jobs don't stop, but as much as you are able to be present with us today, that's going to add value to this space. And we want you to bring your knowledge and skill to this space. Also, in this stay engaged, it means that we will actively and empathically listen, and that happens to be one of our topics today, and trust that others will do the same for us. And the next is to share the mic. This is something that's always a good reminder for myself when I'm in group settings, is that everyone's voice matters, and that we want to make space for every person to contribute. And so, especially when you're in the breakout rooms, I'm really trusting that you're going to take charge and make sure that those people who are being quiet, that you're inviting them to participate and asking them for their thoughts, and that we're being thoughtful to how we break up that time to be as inclusive as possible. The next is to support others. This means that we want to help others navigate the content with patience and kindness and respect. that we're going to ask for clarification for things that we don't understand, and that we are actively rejecting stereotypes, prejudice, and biases, and really focusing on unfiltered evidence. And then the final invitation is that we're here to learn. So we want to stretch, we want to reflect, but also recognize that we're accountable for our words and our actions, and that we can improve with effort. And so these will be reminders for the group activities that we do. And again, you can download this and customize it for however you want to use. Our roadmap for today, as I said, we're going to talk about asset mindset. We're going to talk about empathic listening, and then we're going to talk about intentional feedback. Sound good? All ready? All right, let's dive in. So, when we think about asset mindset, this is one of my favorite things has personally helped me really begin to adapt the way in which I engage with others. But I will admit, it's one of the hardest things to find great resources on. So if anybody's looking for something to write on, this is it. We need more content and tools to help us teach people to develop an asset mindset. So asset mindset, the concept really originated from the psychology and using a strengths-based approach for training. There's been some publication around asset deficit mindset in like the culturally responsive literature around pre-college training. There's another book by a consultant called, I know it looks backwards, but it says Change the Way You See Things through asset-based thinking. And it's a really beautiful book that you can get online on Amazon. This book doesn't particularly approach it through an equity mindset. But what it does really challenge us to think about are we focusing our attention on opportunities rather than problems? And what ways are we focusing on strengths more than weaknesses, on what people have rather than what they don't have? And in what ways are we focusing our attention on what can be done instead of what can't be done, right? And that really parlays to thinking about the Stephen Covey's spheres of influence, thinking about what can we control, what can we influence, what is it that is a value that someone brings, rather than thinking about they're not doing it the way we've always done it, right? So when we look at this picture, now this is a picture of, anybody know what this is? Anybody a scuba diver? So this is a coral banded cleaner shrimp. And, I've been diving for a long time, and I've seen lots of cleaner shrimp like this. And when I came across this guy last year on my vacation, they're easy to spot because they've got these big, long white antenna. And when we look at something, if we focus, so the first thing I saw was the shrimp, and because I was looking for that. But then when I came around the corner, I saw something else. But the prompt here is to think about, when we change the way we see things, the things that you see change. So that's not the full picture. This is the full picture. So this is an eel. And when you look at the picture, what do you see that's happening? Are you scared for the shrimp? Are you scared for the eel? Like, what's happening in this photo? So you're nervous for the shrimp. So Ryan is correct. He's cleaning the teeth. And so even though it's a cleaner shrimp, I had never, in all my years of diving, seen it actually cleaning an eel. And so my first reaction is like, oh, poor shrimp, like what's going to happen to him? And then when I looked at the footage when I got home, I realized like, it is helping the eel, right? Now the eel could look at this shrimp and be like, ugh, it's annoying me, right? Like it's in my mouth, but it's serving it, right? Like there are lots of relationships in the animal kingdom. So with these symbiotic relationships, and this one it's called commensalism. So it's where one species is benefiting and the other is neither harmed nor helped. And so why I offer this picture is that so often when we are trying to understand other people or trying to understand other people's actions and understanding what's happening, we need to zoom out. Because if we stay zoomed in, we can get really a myopic picture of someone, We don't see the risk that they might be putting themselves in. We don't see the environment that they are functioning in. But when we zoom out and we have that wider lens, it allows us to ask the question, what else might be true? And if you spend any time with me in any kind of training, you've heard me say this question, because this is something that one of my mentors, a tool that she gave me early on in my career. And I was spinning out on something. Like I was going straight to a deficit mindset of this person's out to get me, like they're not doing this and they're not doing that. And like I had all of these assumptions. And she says, whoa, Megan, like I want to challenge you to do this thing. She actually doesn't remember doing this, but I still give her credit. She says, I want you to ask yourself what else might be true in this scenario. And so there's 5 words in this statement. What else might be true? And she said, I want you to think of 5 other things that could be true in this scenario. So what that is doing is it's getting me to zoom out, right? Because I had zoomed in. I decided that this person had done this thing and this was the answer. But when I zoomed out, it allowed me to think, well, all of these other things could be true. And by doing that, that reduces my assumptions, right? It helps me have a greater awareness for what that person might be doing. And in many cases, it allows us to see the value that someone's bringing to a space, right? So in this case, the little cleaner shrimp is adding value to the eel's world, right? And so we want to be asking those questions. Like, so when we decrease our focus on what's wrong, that's that deficit-based thinking. And we increase our focus on what's right or what else might be true, which is the asset-based thinking. We build trust, we strengthen relationships, and we increase positive outcomes. So take a minute and think about what's the value that someone might bring to a space rather than what they're doing wrong. Because again, common questions are like, hey, somebody's not doing something right, or they're not doing it the way that they're supposed to. But if we stop and really pause, what if we think about the value that someone is bringing to the space? What else might be true? What's a reflection that somebody has thinking about an asset mindset and how this kind of question can really benefit us and our work, either on tenure committees or otherwise? How can this framing help us improve the way we work with others? Kathy?
So I always view it as there's always another side to the story, and there's something more that perhaps we don't know. So maybe it requires, for me personally, maybe I need to ask more probing questions to get to the root of the problem. Because sometimes you can ask questions that will give you surface level responses, but if you don't dig deeper into it, and that goes back to the point I think you made earlier about listening to the responses and then being able to dig deeper into the response to unpack whatever it is that's causing this to be a problem. Therefore, now you start to uncover opportunities.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples of asset mindset has nothing to do with grown-ups. It has to do with a teacher in a classroom with an elementary student. And I'm going to send this as a resource to you afterwards. But so she's a teacher and she was studying Hofstede's cultural ways of knowing and doing, which we talked a little bit about last time. And so she talks about how she's learning that in a class. And then she notices that this young girl is always in trouble. Like she's just always talking, always doing things that she's not supposed to do. And so instead of like getting the girl in trouble that one day, she watches her. And so the young girl, instead of just talking, she notices that the young girl goes to help a classmate, not to just talk. She's going to help her, right? And so the teacher asked the author of this book, she asked the little girl, who is a Hispanic young girl, which is a collectivist culture, which is very much a helping culture. She says, what is it that you're doing? And the girl says, oh, I'm helping her. She needed help. She looked like she needed help. So this young girl, through empathic listening to the space, noticed that her colleague, her classmate needed help, went to help her. And so the teacher then realized, well, what an asset this is to the classroom. Whereas she had been in trouble, they had created this whole like sticker system of like behavioral kinds of things. And so that's a reminder for us that we have to, with others, adults too, right? Like, how are we just saying, you're not doing it right, you're doing something wrong, but to look and pay attention, to listen to the environment and recognize, how are they bringing their strengths? And how is it an asset to our team, to our department, to our culture? And seeing that for what it is, rather than saying there's something wrong with you, you're not doing it right, you need to do it our way, right? So let me check the chat here. So it's certainly important to check our assumptions. Go ahead.
I was going to say there's a couple of things people mentioned in the chat. It's about learning from each other, or is it about forcing someone into a certain behavior, which is quite an interesting comment. And then Mary also said, it helps us to slow down our thinking, but also to check our thinking. And a couple of other comments. Kimberly, it's important to check our assumptions. Kathy, listen not only to what the person says verbally, but what they are saying or not saying through their body language. And that's really important to just take notice. And I think that was the common theme there, just to take a moment, just to pause. Go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, thanks for drawing attention to those things. All right, so now we're going to jump to the second key piece, which is empathic listening, but we're going to talk about empathy first. So what is empathy? What is empathy? Add it to the chat, to the Slido, add it to the chat, turn on your mic. Tell us, what do you think empathy is? What is it to you? How do we empathically engage? What is empathy? What does it mean to us? Understanding and appreciating someone else's perspective. What else? To walk alongside others, yeah, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. You listen so close, you can predict what they might say or feel. Understanding and appreciating perspectives, having the ability, yeah. Yeah, so to me, I really think about to practice empathy is to try and feel, to really feel what others might be feeling. And to do that, you have to try to understand their perspective. You have to zoom out. You have to be able to look at the bigger picture and understand why people do things that they do. Thank you for these contributions. So empathy, and this is drawing from a couple of different places. Empathy, it is our ability to understand and share the feelings of another. It's connecting to the emotion another person is experiencing and not the actual experience. So we don't have to know that lived experience, but we can connect to the emotion that someone is feeling. And empathy, and this particular definition is from Brené Brown, empathy fuels connection, whereas sympathy drives disconnection. So sympathy is like, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you. Oh, like that doesn't feel the same, right? But empathy is driving that connection. And for us as educators, for us as, trying to create inclusive and equitable environments where people feel like they belong, that is anchored in connection, right? So we have to function from a place of empathy. Another quote from Brené Brown is, she says, empathy is a skill that can bring people together and make people feel included, while sympathy creates an uneven power dynamic and can lead to more isolation and disconnection. And so again, if we want to fuel connection, if we want to foster belonging for others, we have to engage in a way that's trying to connect with others. And so there are 4 qualities of empathy, and this is a concept developed by Teresa Wiseman. The first is perspective taking, second is staying out of judgment, the third is recognizing emotion, and then 4, communicating that connection. And so, perspective taking is, again, it's that zooming out. How are we zooming out to understand their perspective? How are we engaging in a way that we aren't judging their tasks? And judgment is, judgment is something that's so rooted in a lot of people's experiences, particularly those of us who were maybe raised in like very legalistic kind of environments, where people can sort of start to push their values on other people, that becomes so embedded in how we engage with people. But if we want to practice empathy, we cannot use those kinds of judgments. We have to remain out of that. Recognizing emotion is the ability of that little third grader to look across the classroom and say, my friend needed help, right? It's recognizing what people are experiencing and going to them, and it's communicating that connection. This is learning to feel with people and recognizing that if we want to practice empathy, it is a vulnerable choice on our behalf. Now, we've all heard of the golden rule. This is something we learned very early on in life. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat people how you want to be treated. But I don't even know who to credit for this, but whoever came up with the platinum rule, they outlined this as do unto others as they would want to be done to them, right? So it's treating people how they want to be treated. And so this platinum rule, it's a variation of that golden rule that calls for a more thoughtful approach when dealing with others. We ask, what do they need? How do they want to be treated? And again, that takes that empathy. It takes that zooming out to see how do we understand someone's experiences. If you want to learn more about that, I wrote a blog post on that. And so with these two concepts in mind, I want us to quickly think about what barriers prevent us from practicing empathy and the platinum rule. What barriers prevent us from practicing empathy in the platinum rule? You got the Slido, the chat, unmute and share with us. But what are some of those barriers? The platinum rule is do unto others as they would want to be done unto them. Treat people how they want to be treated. Task orientation, time restrictions, rigid processes, nice. Our own need to be successful, so ego. We make assumptions, time. Thinking you know what is best for someone else, yeah. Pressures, task orientation. A lot of the things that you're identifying here are very much individualistic behaviors, right? Things that many of us have been conditioned and raised to operate. I will admit, as a trained engineer, I am highly trained to be task oriented. But in my work, I have to intentionally try to not do that, to pull back and bring empathy into a space. And sometimes I'm so grateful when people remind me that I'm not doing that, because sometimes I just jump right in, get to work. Even today, didn't ask. I usually try to ask something about the people's environments. But we have these modes of operating, right? And they, again, prevent us from practicing that empathy and treating people with the respect and dignity that they deserve sometimes. Hierarchical structures of power, culture, privilege, all the isms.
I think the one that stands out for me is thinking that you know what's best for someone else. So even in working as an evaluator on programs, it's lovely to see all the proposals that come out about outreach and how we think that we know best about the communities in which we are doing the outreach. And then when you bring the comment, so has anyone gone to ask what the students need? Has anyone gone to ask what the affinity groups need? Has anyone gone to ask? And so taking that moment once again is really important. And so I just really love that, thinking that we know what's best for someone else. I do that with my own kids. You should do this. And they go, that's not what I want to do. And I'm like, no, you should do this. No, mom. So just wanted to jump in and say that, because sometimes it's not about P&T. Sometimes it's just about life and family.
Yeah. Yeah. Like we started, like these are just good human practices. And so that connects us to the listening component of this. Like listening is one of the most useful and critical skills to life, but how many of us like got formal training on listening? Like this wasn't a lesson in kindergarten, was it? Neither was financial management, also really important in life. And let's bring these into the classroom, folks. So we're going to talk about listening. And I love this quote by Stephen Covey. He says, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. And that really connects to those egos that some of you were talking about with the barriers. And so I like this because, we have to ask ourselves, am I listening? Who am I listening to? And how can I help others listen? How do my mindset, my worldview, and my biases filter what I hear? And that's really the key part of this. Let me see what Ryan says. Some people then apply that parental attitude to peers and adults. Oh, that's when it's okay. I want to give you a moment to self-reflect here. I want you to think of a time when you felt heard. Think of a time when you felt heard. What was unique about that experience that led you to feel like the other person truly listened to you? And how did you feel as a result of being heard? So just think about that for a minute. When did you really feel heard? What was unique about the interaction? And how did you feel as a result? Maybe we can take one story.
I can share a story.
Thanks.
And this goes back to many years ago. Some people in this group know that my prior life, I was a flight attendant. And there was a policy at the company that was changing. And it was in regard to, we had a program where flight attendants could fly half the month. And the company was going to put those flight attendants on reserve. And that was going to create a big problem for that group that were mostly moms working half a month because they were trying to balance family and their jobs. So at any rate, I wrote a letter to the president of the company. And lo and behold, a couple weeks after I sent the letter, he called me in the middle of the afternoon. And I answered the phone and he said, is Tammy there? And this is, and said his name. And of course, like I was speechless that he was actually calling me at home, the president of this large company. And the first thing he said to me was, I know you have small children. Is this a good time for you to talk? So the answer to the question is, how did I feel? Somebody listened to me. He listened to my letter. He called me and asked me questions about what could they do better for the program to make it better for us. So he asked questions. He listened to me. They did, by the way, change the policy, but I felt valued. I just was amazed that the president of a company would respond and call little old me to ask me questions.
That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that, Tammy. Like it gave me chills. And when you tell this story, like to feel seen and to feel heard and respected. That's really beautiful. Mm-hmm. Chris, did you have something you wanted to add?
Hopefully my internet connection stays stable enough for this to get out. I would say that one of the biggest examples of this that I had over the whole COVID was when Peggy stood up during the opening day meeting and acknowledged all of the pain and suffering that she had gone through. And it made me feel much more seen rather than being, this is why we can't help you, or that's not the policy, or the acting like a human being that's going through the same things we are goes a very long way towards making everybody else feel heard and seen.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know the scenario that you're talking about, but what I heard in that is that you had a leader step up and in a very vulnerable space, share their humanity. right? And so many leaders are conditioned to not do that, right? As I mentioned, experienced loss it hit me harder than I thought. And I was in the middle of this really huge contract with my first industry client. And I was supposed to be flying out to California to give this keynote and doing all these trainings. And I just I couldn't process. I was the one that was by her bedside when it happened. I just couldn't process all the things. And this engineering company, they modeled to me empathy and human compassion and listening in a way I had never experienced. And I was so thrilled to talk to them and be grateful to that. But, how are we modeling that for other people? It takes a lot of effort to be gracious when people are going through life, and we don't always see those things. We can make assumptions of oh, well, they haven't responded to my email in 2 weeks, yada, 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 all these assumptions. What else might be true, right? That's the question that we want to ask. How do we really engage in this? So I want to give us a couple of tools around listening. And then that's going to lead us into a couple of notes on feedback, and then we're going to go into our scenarios. So there are 3 degrees of active listening. And so active listening, it's this ability to focus completely on a speaker, to understand their message, and to comprehend the information and respond thoughtfully. So unlike passive listening, which is the act of hearing a speaker without retaining their message, this highly valued interpersonal communication skill ensures that you're able to engage and later recall specific details without needing information repeated. And so active listeners use verbal and nonverbal techniques to show and keep their attention on the speaker. So this not only supports your ability to focus, but it also ensures that the speaker can see that you are focused and engaged. So instead of thinking about and mentally rehearsing what you might say when the speaker's done, an active listener carefully considers the speaker's words and commits that information to memory, right? And so ways that you can do that is sort of repeating, paraphrasing, and reflecting on what you hear, right? So that's, instead of you jumping into your answer, you're saying, is this what I heard? I think this is what I heard. And that gives space for someone to say, no, that I don't think you understood me correctly. And to have a conversation about that. Right. So, again, if we want to actively listen, and if we want to empathically listen, we need to repeat and paraphrase and reflect, because otherwise our own filter, we could be way off. Right. And we want to give people space to make sure that they're really feeling heard in these conversations that we're having. Now, there are 3 levels of listening, and this comes from a book called Coactive Coaching by Kenzie House and a whole slew of other people. And so the 3 levels of listening in this book, the author detail that there's internal listening, focused listening, and then global listening. So this sort of level 1, internal listening, our awareness is on ourselves. So we're listening to the other person's words, but our attention is on what it means to us personally. And so from an empathic listening standpoint, you're trying to do that, right? You're trying to have that connection point. What does this mean to me potentially personally? How do I begin to understand? And so this includes your thoughts on it, your judgments, your feelings, and whatever conclusions that you might have. Now, focused listening, this is sort of level 2. And there's a sharp focus here on the other person. So you're listening to their words, their expressions, and their emotions. You're paying attention to context clues. So not only what they say, but how they say it and what they don't say, right? Because that's sometimes as important as what they do say. And you also tune into what you perceive, again, what you perceive as their values and how they look at the world, right? And so to be able to do that truly effectively, we need to have that wide lens. We need to have a multicultural competence to understand different ways of knowing and doing. And so really level 2 is empathic, it's clarifying, and it's collaborative. So the question here is asking, what does this mean to them? Right? That's focused listening. And then the last is global listening. And this is something that I find incredibly hard to do virtually. So global listening is to better understand, we're asking questions of what are all of the discernible elements? What are they telling me? So this level 3, you listen as if you and the other person are really the center of a universe, right? And everywhere else, everything else is sort of, subdued, but yet you're still having a sense of the environment as if you're the only people in that environment. And so the authors, they describe this as like a force field that contains you. How many of you have ever had a conversation with someone and you're in a busy place and they're like at their phone and they're like, oh, hey, and like they're so engaged, like you do not feel like you're in a bubble with someone because they're so surrounded by all the other people and things that are going around. So global listening like allows us to read a room, monitor how it changes in response to you, and adjusting appropriately. As teachers, as facilitators, like this is really key to being a good educator. It's tapping into our intuition, but it is essential to keep in mind that our intention could be very biased, right? Our intuition could be very biased. So again, what are all the elements telling us? Kathy, did you have something you want to add?
I just have a question on focused listening. When you talked about this, you mentioned that, we're listening to what they say, how they say it, and what they don't say. But in trying to discern what they're not saying, does that then also bring in a level of assumption and judgment? Because you're trying to kind of get to, well, what is it they're not saying to me?
Well, so just like you said earlier, you ask questions, right? You're asking those questions to try to probe in those gaps.
Okay.
Pam, did you have something you want to add?
I did, and sometimes just really being observant. You can look at facial expressions. May I give an example, if that's okay?
Yeah.
So yesterday I was at a service and something was said, and my face was very perplexed. And the person that made the comment said, "Hey, Pamela, is everything okay? Your facial expression said something different. Is this a place where you can share how you're feeling?" And so maybe just taking a moment to just look and then ask the questions, I think that's also helpful.
Thanks for sharing that, Pamela. Yeah, so again, we have to use, again, our intuition and these kinds of things. But when we recognize what people aren't saying, just like when we're trying to create inclusive spaces, we have to bring people in. And so just because they're not saying something doesn't mean they're not feeling something or thinking something. How many times do you ask someone if they're okay and they're like, "I'm fine"? Like there are different tones of "I'm fine" that can really tell you, like, are you really fine? Like, what's really going on? And so it gives us that space to really engage and plug in and see what's going on. And the story that was just shared about a leader being vulnerable and talking about something, for us, if we want to be inclusive leaders, we need to do that, because otherwise people don't feel safe in a work environment to bring their lives. And so we could say what's going on, but if they don't feel safe telling us what's going on, then that's a big block of what they may not be saying. Does that help, Kathy?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, so a couple of things here that we want to keep in mind. So when we're listening, we want to be aware that there are some barriers to listening, right? So when we look at listening and gender, so there's lots of research on gender differences in communication, and they've been influenced by gender stereotypes and really falsely connected to biological differences, right? The whole men are from Mars or men are from Venus, it's all BS. Those are deeply like stereotype things. And so more recent research has found that people communicate in ways that conform to gender stereotypes in some situations and not in others, which shows that our communication really is more influenced by societal expectations than by innate or gendered hardwiring. And so also what we know about gender is that men are more likely to interrupt each other in same gender interactions as a conscious or subconscious attempt to establish some dominance. And women can also do this. I had been given feedback years ago that I was in an environment where I was trying to be equal to a man. Imagine that, me equal to a man. And because I had not been seen that way, and I kept interrupting him, and it was an unconscious act of dominance, right? I was trying to make space for myself in a room, and my way of doing that was to constantly interrupt him. And I had no idea that I was doing that until someone was like, Megan, like, are you paying attention to this? Right. And so we have to be aware of our own positionality, our own internal feelings, our own traumas, and how they are acting up in a space, and how we're engaging with them. Culture. So when we look at culture, so different cultures have placed more importance on listening than others. So in general, collectivist cultures tend to value listening more than individualistic cultures that are more speaker oriented. There also is a different value placed on verbal and nonverbal meaning. And that so varies by culture and how we listen. So a low context communication style is one in which much of the meaning is generated within an interaction comes from that verbal communication used rather than the nonverbal or contextual cues. So for example, US Americans of European descent generally have like a low context communication style, while again, these are generalized, while people in East Asian and Latin American cultures have a high context communication style. So again, something that you can dig in and research a little bit deeper. And then finally, looking at class and socioeconomic status. So research shows that people with higher social status, so that's your position in any kind of social hierarchy, that could be if you're a boss or, a worker, they are more likely to interrupt others. So keep this in mind and be prepared if you're speaking to a high status person, or try to resist it if you are a high status person in any kind of interaction. Basically, we're talking about power here, folks. All of this is about power and the ways in which it manifests in our interactions. Okay, here's a simple acronym called HERE. The HERE strategy is by Donna Wilson and Marcus Conyers, and this helps us recognize and block out noise and devote attention to listening to others. So the HERE strategy is this acrostic. And so the first is HALT. We want to stop what we're doing, clear our inner dialogue, and to give the speaker our attention. Engage is we're going to focus on the speaker, signal to them that you're focused on what they're saying. Anticipate. This is where we listen with anticipation and expectation that we might learn something. Listen if you might be wrong, and like you are going to learn something new and interesting. And then replay. To ensure understanding, we want to replay a paraphrased analysis of the information that we heard. And so again, I'll drop a link here. Now we're getting into the meat, and we're going to go into our breakout rooms here in just a minute. There's the HERE strategy if you want to learn more. And so here, this last piece is our feedback. What we say and how we say it matters. And really, we've invested most of our time here talking about our lens, that sort of wide lens, and listening, because I firmly believe that when we use that, it's going to equip us to give better feedback, because we have to listen. We have to understand the environment. We have to understand the person's needs, whether they're ready to receive the feedback that we have for them. And we need to be really thoughtful to the language that we're using. And we want to consider, are we telling someone or are we coaching them? And that's really the big prompt for this. Now, in the handout that you have, there are some characteristics of specific and effective feedback. Again, the goal here is not to dive super deep into this. I've got tons of other recorded workshops if you want to dive in and learn more about some of these different components. But we want to think about mostly today how our filters affect our feedback. And so think about for a minute the way in which we talked about filters today and in our other sessions. What are the filters that influence the feedback that we give? What are the filters that influence our feedback?
Is it the feedback that we receive or the feedback that we give?
In this case, I'm talking about how we give feedback, but it's probably the same as how we might receive it. Yeah. So your demographics, who you are, your positionality. What else? Power. And how we wield it, how we succumb to it, how much you care about the issue. Yeah. Defensiveness, empathy, how you were raised, the environment, the context, the risk. Yeah, there could be risk in how we give and receive feedback. Your level of emotional intelligence. What's at stake? Previous experiences, how you are perceived as a leader, how confident you feel with the topic you're giving feedback on. All right. Your own mental state. That's true. Like, our mental state is, how cloudy our bandwidth is going to affect our clarity and how we give feedback. The consequences, anxiety, so our own feelings. Great stuff here. So certainly lots of things that influence our feedback. And one of the key practices that we want to encourage you to employ is that, you've got this tool on how to plan your feedback. And there are 4 components I've broken the prompts down into, is to establish our purpose, to analyze our filter. That's what we're going to spend our energy on thinking about today. How to craft your feedback, and then how to prepare your approach. And so those are all really useful kinds of things, but we want to think about, how do we analyze our filter? So we've talked about previously that we need to reflect on our positionality. So positionality, if you need a reminder, that is the social, political context that creates our identity, and how our identity influences and biases our perception of and outlook on the world. It's recognizing power and privilege. It's recognizing space and location. And so we have to understand how these things change and how we engage with others. We need to make sure that we value multiple ways of knowing and doing, so that we're not just honoring the values of like our individualistic culture, if that's how you're raised, that we're recognizing that there are lots of ways of knowing and doing, and that we're not over privileging one over another. We want to make sure that we're employing an asset or a strengths-based perspective. So we're asking those questions. What else might be true? What's the value that this person brings? Rather than looking at this as something being wrong, how do I see this as that value? How do we minimize power dynamics? I know that the education system is like just rife with power, because that's how the institutions have been built. But y'all, power is bad for relationships and connections, right? If we want to build connection, if we want to have and practice empathy, if we want to be an inclusive leader, we have to minimize those power dynamics. How do we begin to do that in a way? And then how do we assess the climate for inclusivity, right? If we're getting ready to give feedback, we need to think about what is it that's happening in this environment and this space that could affect this person. So what we're going to do next is we're going to set you up into some small groups. So you can, I'm going to drop the instructions here on the chat. We're going to open up a Padlet here. And so if you don't know each other, do a quick round of introductions. It's helpful to determine roles as like a timekeeper, note taker, spokesperson. You're going to read the scenario that we assigned to your group, discuss. And so your scenario will be your group number. And so you are going to go into the Padlet here, each scenario, and then the instructions are here on the blue on the left. And then the prompts are here. In what ways could an asset mindset change the course of the conversation? As in, what else might be true? What's of value? And what ways could empathic listening change the faculty members' feelings of belongingness? Thinking of the platinum rule or that HERE strategy. And what would effective feedback look and sound like? And this is where you can consider role playing if you want to. If you don't, if you're terrified by that, don't do it. But make sure that if there are people in your group who want to, invite them to do that. And then here is this PDF that I've shared with you here as well. So add notes here. If you have additional ideas, things that you want to share, post them there. So if you all will get those things open, I'm going to get the breakout rooms queued.
Was there a link for the Padlet?
Yes, it's on number 2 in the chat.
Okay.
All right, so I've got the rooms created. Yes. Okay. I'm going to set a timer for 15 minutes. All right. So again, I'm going to broadcast the instructions to the chat, the link to the Padlets in the chat. If that's not working, please let me know. And we'll see you back in 15 minutes. Yes.
That's
Everybody's
everybody.
back. Welcome back, everyone.
Wow. So you all had lively discussions. I was popping in and out and heard quite a few things. So what were you talking about in there? You had 4 different scenarios. So what happened? What did you hear? What did you say? Anybody want to share their scenario? How about we start there? So what was your scenario?
I can go first.
Okay.
So ours was scenario 3. So, you can all read it there, but basically we have this faculty member who seems to be a really great teacher, really, strong, extra mentoring to marginalized students, particularly trans students. But the faculty member comes to, to somebody and says, I don't feel like I'm getting enough grant money, and all this other kind of research-based stuff as opposed to teaching and seeking advice because they're going for tenure. So we said a lot of stuff because in the scenario, the person giving advice just says, well, just work harder. So first of all, that's not good advice, because if they're having trouble with this, this process, just saying work harder isn't going to help them navigate it any better because they're already struggling with the grant process. But then also connecting them with the right people, we didn't think was great advice either. So in terms of asset mindset, our first thought was, well, focus on what they are doing, right, with the outreach to students and dealing with the marginalized students especially. And we thought, well, maybe there's a good way to build on those skills and maybe get some grants related to that work, something to help marginalized students that they would have that knowledge base on. So that's the asset mindset. But then also another thing we thought of with the empathic listening, our thought with the empathic listening was, well, first asking them, why do they think that's a big a concern? Because the person responding, we didn't realize this until later, never acknowledges that research is more important than teaching. Maybe at this place they're on equal footing, or maybe teaching is a stronger piece. So first need to ask the person, well, why do you feel like you're lacking there? Why do you feel that's a concern? Mm-hmm. And we talked about how, I was talking to a full-time faculty member who's in the tenure process this year, actually, who's new. And he was asking me a bunch of stuff about, well, do I need, is this important? Is this something that's going to make me more likely to get tenure? And I said, no, not at all. It was something that isn't relevant here, but knowing what those expectations are is important. So we thought that was a good place to do some empathic listening and some, asking questions as part of the feedback, just to make sure, we understand why they're feeling this lack. And then from there, if it's determined that is something that needs to be built on, we thought a good asset mindset would be focusing on the work they're already doing, helping with that, and not just saying, work harder. So those were our big takeaways.
Thank you, Ryan. I think Megan in the chat had asked if anyone had heard of advice such as this, or if anybody had experienced conversations or heard of conversations such as this, such as the work harder.
Yes.
And so what does that look like? How do you think that was received? If it was for you, how was it received?
I think it's insulting. They are working hard already.
I think that's a great point, right? To tell someone to work harder assumes that they're not working hard. And it takes no reflection and no awareness of barriers that they're facing, and no empathy. And we can imagine, I mean, first of all, these aren't far-fetched ideas of what happens, right? Like,
No.
imagine this person, giving this advice that they're in a hurry. They're like, I got 5 minutes, what do you need? They're in transition, like, probably they have the best intentions, right? But it just so happens that they aren't serving this person. They aren't helping this person. They're actually creating more harm and more barriers that they're facing. They're creating a space where they feel significantly less belonging, value, affirmation, and in this kind of environment. Kimberly, were you wanting to add something else?
No.
Okay. Can we go to, because we don't have that much more time left, but I would love to at least just do one more scenario, just one more, maybe scenario 2. I think that was a teaching evaluation. I think so. I can't remember. Yes, that was it. So would anybody like to comment on like what happened here? What did you see? What bubbled up in conversation for you?
Okay.
Go
I'll
ahead,
talk.
Tammy.
I was hoping someone else would speak, but okay, I'll go for it. So basically, in our scenario, we have a faculty member and a chair, and they're going over the evaluations, student feedback of the faculty member who is openly gay. And the faculty member talks about some of the potential bias that people have against gays, and the chair basically blows it off and suggests that the faculty member do more office hours, give easier tests, and consider being less flamboyant in the classroom. So what we don't know about this is we really don't know much about the chair. So that kind of just, to me, is like, well, we don't know. We don't know the story of the chair, but basically in this scenario, the chair has is not empathetic to the faculty member, not giving any acknowledgement of what the faculty member is saying about the bias, there being bias, one, or how that's making the faculty member feel. And perhaps, the chair could have learned a thing or two by listening to the experience and grown from it, but did not listen. The other thing is it pretty much likely shut down the faculty member any feelings of belongingness or being able to grow professionally. And then in our, I loved our little group, and we shared a lot of personal stories that related to this. But one of the things that Tasha shared was how in a personal experience she had, she was told you can't change who you are and use that as an asset. And in this scenario, I say the chair is saying, consider being less flamboyant in the classroom, which is pretty much shutting down who the faculty member is, where they could share that experience with students, that students might grow from it as well. Okay, so I'll share the mic now.
That's just wonderful, Tammy. Thank you for that synopsis of what went on. Megan, do I have time to ask one more question?
One more.
Okay. So in all of these, I just had a question. In what ways, and this came out in one of the groups, in what ways does the aversion to bias impact the ways, or the aversion to even think about bias, impact the ways in which they were able, or you could be able to engage in meaningful conversation? I know that's a long question.
I can add that was one of the questions that our group came up with, that we needed to ask that question. What is the impact of race, bias, ethnicity, positionality on this whole reason she was being denied publication? We felt that was an important question to ask.
Thank you for that. And how does that impact then the way in which people filter what they hear?
We kind of brought this the similar type of question to ours as well, because the committee member is not valuing or is not even recognizing or acknowledging what is of value to the Black faculty member who's in tenure. Not only that, but the Black faculty member seems to have more of a student-centered focus than the committee member.
Mm, mm. These are all really good things to reflect and think about. And so I wish we had time to go through all the scenarios and really unpack everything that is in that suitcase, because there's a lot, but at least it gives you a teaser or just an opening of the suitcase of your carry-on to see what you could then begin to pull out and try on, as you're going, or if you're going through TSA and they say, you can't take that, what do we not need to take on the carry-on? And Megan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Right. Thanks, Pamela.
Lejet.
So, and wrapping up our conversation, and I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer, but for the sake of time, I want to sort of create an endpoint here. Over the course of our 3 months together, we've given you lots of tools. And so you have 5 really specific tools that you can use to begin to modify the way in which you engage in your environments. I fully expected that we wouldn't get to this activity. But in this, and the second link on there is a Padlet. What I would encourage you all to spend some time reflecting on your own. So all these tools are here. And then I will follow up with, again, all the links to the websites where you can get and they're all in your handouts as well. But let this be a collective space for you to share, or whatever Tyler puts up on y'all's LMS, just use it as a place to share your reflections of how you will use these tools. Like, what's your plan of action? If you leave and you never do any of this stuff again, we failed. So we want you to take this and to begin to employ them in your practices, and really think about how are we fostering belonging and success for the people around us, whether it's in the tenure review process, whether it's in their own professional process, or whatever that might be. All of us have that responsibility and an opportunity to do that. Before you go today, I do always encourage people to do a reflection on things that you learned. Any final questions? So take a minute to just reflect, because as we know, this is really critical to learning. And then I'm going to add another link in the chat that I do welcome your feedback, and I share that with Dr. Garcia. That's the wrong thing. Feedback, here we go. All right, so you can go to engineerinclusion.com/thanks. My contact information is there. And then one last plug for Pamela's book. You can order the copy of her book, Promotion and Tenure. And so again, I'm just so grateful for you all. And if you have the opportunity, if you want to stick around and talk about your one action item or something that you've learned, I'd love to hear them. So what's something, so with that, thank you. I'm so grateful for your time and your commitment to equity and inclusion in the tenure process, and to creating more student-centered and focused environments. And I'm a resource to you, so please reach out and then connect with Tyler and Christina to make sure that you get continued access to all of the resources on their platform. Thank you so much for those of y'all who have to drop off. For those of you who get to stay, share something with me. So Kimberly, you said that you've learned about asset mindset and need to be reminded.
Well, I would say I knew about that idea, but it's something you got to keep revisiting. So I appreciate the opportunity to be reminded and opportunity to practice.
Good. Thanks, Kimberly. Thanks. Anyone else want to share something? Stacy, you learned about minimizing power to build relationships. Tell me more.
Oh, I just really like that idea. I hadn't thought about it in that way. How much I know that for me on the other end, when I feel a real strong power dynamic, I really shut down, and it makes me less likely or trusting. So I can see how that would work, like in acknowledging that, and like in our particular example, when you share things like, I've struggled also with trying to publish a paper, that works to minimize that. When you say, I've had similar experiences, that can help minimize. And so I think sharing those things and being vulnerable is helpful.
Yeah, so true. Thanks, Stacy. Thanks. Tyler, your action items renewed focus on asking questions to learn something new rather than trying to confirm an assumption. Yeah. Want to tell me anything more about that?
Yeah, I'll mention that with the hear piece. I'd like to anticipate, because it caught me off guard. Because at first I was thinking, oh, is that just like, I think I often anticipate in a way of, oh, here's what I think it is. Let me ask a question to kind of confirm if that's true. And I like that it set up the idea of anticipating that I want to learn something new and being very open to that. And that should be more the source of my questions rather than like my questions confirming my own thoughts.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you like that. And Tyler, this really builds a lot on some of the listening work that we did and the coaching program.
Definitely.
And I remember that you really liked, I think I remember that you really liked the questioning part of that session as well.
Yeah, it's continually helpful in terms of like with colleagues, with faculty, like, yeah, just a major focus to have.
Good. Well, thanks so much, Tyler, Kimberly, and Stacy. Anything else you want to, let's see, anybody else in the room with this? Oh, Tammy's still here too.
I'm here, I'm listening.
Just listening.
I would say that the thing that probably pops into my mind first, and I'd share what others have said as well, but the first thing that pops into my mind is we don't all travel the same path. So the importance of taking the time to listen to somebody else's journey and how we can connect with that person and how we can grow from somebody else's experience.
Yeah. I think that's so true. And I love this visualization of having that wide lens, because that requires us to recognize that, yeah, it's a different path. And like your path may be in a desert and mine may be, a luxuriously paved path, right? And knowing that the environment and the ways in which we've all processed and moved through life is so different. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Stacy, anything else on your mind?
No, that was it. This is so helpful because I'm going to be giving feedback to someone next week. So I'm going to use some of these practices. I'm really excited about it.
Awesome. Great. And I have on my website, if you want to learn more about like a more in-depth session just on feedback, if you have time, you can look at those. Let me stop sharing.
I'll do that.
And I can drop that link in the chat.
And one last final thing I would say is that, first of all, thank you. This has been very helpful. It's been helpful hearing from you and Pam and all my colleagues, but this applies to so much more than our jobs. It just applies to life, and for me personally, for my kids and my grandkids, incorporating these things into who I am. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Tammy, for your feedback. I appreciate that. Awesome. Well, Tammy and Stacy, again, thanks for your energy and your contributions today. And let me know how I can help.
Okay. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.